Hey party people, I'm Pastor Lia Scholl from Wake Forest Baptist Church, and so grateful that you're taking time to watch this today. We are in the midst of a sermon series called Unraveled, Seeking God When Our Plans Fall Apart. And today's reflection is about the woman at the well, and it's about unraveling shame. So be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Picture me, 6 years old, in the first grade at McDermott Elementary School. I was a talkative, active kid, not that that surprises any of you. And I was often done with assignments faster than any of the other kids. So I was working my way through the SRA box. SRAs were color-coded reading cards that helped to increase reading ability. They were self-directed learning cards, and I was determined to do the whole giant box. I was a bright child. So when we had a school-wide musical, my job was to help a fellow student prepare to be Dudley Pippin in the 70s classic Free to Be You and Me. Each day we went through his lines until he learned them perfectly, and so did I. And then the night of the big show came, and the boy who was to play Dudley Pippin was nowhere to be found. Rumor had it that he had shot his eye out with a rubber band, or maybe he had crossed his eyes and held his face in such a way and someone had popped him on the back of the head and his face had frozen like that. We had no Dudley, only me. I knew the lines. I was informed that I would be Dudley Pippin. Against my will. Dudley is a boy, I protested to no avail. I performed. I hated it. I cried. And my dad acted like I was a hero. But I did not want to play a boy. Trying his best, I'm sure, to appease me, my father said, "Dudley can be a girl's name too." I wanted to reply, "Dad, I'm not stupid." You'd think that nearly 50 years later, I could remember this story without shame, but I cannot. When I think of this moment, I feel shame in my belly. My belly feels like I've just taken 4 no-dos and gotten onto the back of a boat. And I have the beginnings of a caffeine overdose and motion sickness at the same time. That's what shame feels like to me. I wonder what it felt like to that woman at the well in our scripture. Here she was, avoiding people at the well by coming in at the midday. And then Jesus shows right up and starts talking to her. The woman sort of gives Jesus the Samaritan equivalent of, "Are you talking to me?" I mean, he shouldn't have been talking to her. There are barriers between the woman at the well and Jesus, racial, gender, religious barriers, and especially a power barrier. But there was also the barrier of shame. After promising her the water of life, Jesus tells her to go get her husband. And she says, "I have no husband." And that's when I imagine that she too feels that pot of coffee on a boat in her belly. Maybe perhaps her stomach goes all wonky like mine does. Do you know the difference between guilt and shame? According to Carla McLaren, the author of The Language of Emotions, guilt is not an emotion. Guilt is a state of circumstance. You're either guilty or not guilty in relation to the legal and moral code you value. Guilt is a factual state, while shame is an emotion. Good shame keeps us from committing the things that will make us guilty. Shame is like remorse when we recognize that we have done something wrong or are going to do something wrong. Good shame helps us avoid bad things or helps us to set things right. But many of us were taught about shame by being shamed. McLaren calls this manufactured and applied shame. Dudley Pippin's, for me, is manufactured and applied shame. The woman at the well is also experiencing this because she is not meeting someone's imposed standards. And this applied shame can lead us to having an unhealthy connection to our own shame, to the good shame. And sometimes when that happens, we're coerced into embodying other people's ideas of right and wrong. Like the woman at the well, sometimes we can get stuck in shame. Shaming messages and labels can form a tremendous amount of our personality and identity. I think that's what the woman at the well was expressing when she said, "I have no husband." I think she probably said it like this: "I have no husband." It was another way of saying, "I'm a loser." Y'all, shame is, at its root, anger. And when we feel angry, that means our boundaries have been violated. Sometimes it's because our boundaries are not well defined. The first step out of that kind of shame is beginning to listen to your self-talk. I particularly like to write down what I'm saying to myself in my head. And then use your intellect to consider whether that self-talk is truthful. You can explore your own moral code, and did you know that you can change your moral code to make sure that you're living up to your own expectations instead of not measuring up to someone else's? And then you can create choices for yourself. Do you want to continue those behaviors? Do they fit with who you want to be? And you can build better boundaries. Boundaries, though, are not barriers. Barriers are no solution to shame. In fact, for some folks, barriers must be overcome in order to overcome shame. Jesus overcame those barriers for the woman at the well. And for some folks, especially trauma survivors, shame can be toxic. This is what we feel like when we blame ourselves for the bad things that have happened to us. If you are in a post-traumatic toxic shame spiral, though, I want you to know there is hope. Healing is possible. And for healing to occur, McLaren says you need a sacred space and likely a skilled practitioner with you, maybe a therapist or some sort. I believe that Jesus created a sacred space for the woman at the well to be healed from toxic post-traumatic shame. He listened to her. He broke down barriers while honoring her boundaries. He accepted her, and her shame, well, it got turned into an evangelical fervor where she wanted to share the good news, her good news of being liberated from shame to all of her neighbors. The woman at the well no longer cared what others thought of her, which is a pretty good sign that her shame spiral was over. And instead, she wanted others to experience the liberation that she was experiencing. The bottom line is this, folks. There is nothing that you can do that renders you unlovable. There is nothing that you have experienced that excludes you from the radical, liberating love of God. Being open to that love, letting it take a hold of you, breaking down the barriers to that love can change you deeply. It can clear out those shame monsters and lead you into a world with more choices. where you can't help but invite others into your liberation. That's what Jesus was talking about when he talked about living water. As for that little girl, that precocious little tow-headed little girl having to get in front of a whole lot of people and play a boy, I grew up. I realized that many of those gender roles that people told me were important really weren't important. Heck, these days, maybe there are girls named Dudley. I love you, and I love being your pastor.